Cold Case, An Angelica Dale Mystery by P.K. Armstrong. Chapter 26. I was lost. No, not lost. It would be more accurate to say I was at a loss. I needed to find a way to get into Moira Adams' home to search for the diary, but couldn't think of a way. My first thought was to show up as my Lynn Shaw persona, with a camera and feigned taking preliminary pictures. But she wouldn't leave me alone long enough to make copies, even with the scanner wand. Honestly, I wasn't averse to a little breaking and entering, but only in the direst circumstances. I resorted to it a couple of years ago when I thought Violet might be in danger from her guardian and her attacker. This, however, was a cold case, and no one was in immediate danger. I didn't feel the situation warranted it. I had finished breakfast a little absent-mindedly because not only was I consumed by my problem, but I was also trying to avoid looking Daniel in the eye. I looked outside and saw the sky devoid of all clouds and moisture, and the sun was shining despite the cold. I needed to clear my brain of clutter. I was sitting in the family room organizing my case notes with one part of my mind and trying to think of a solution with the other part when the answer came in the form of a phone call. "Hello?" I cautiously answered the unidentified number. "Angelica Dale?" I recognized the voice of Delaney Stevens. "Call me Angel." "Yes, Angel, I was wondering if you've made any progress in the case," he asked tentatively. Now, this could just be his curiosity, him making sure he wasn't losing his exclusive. But Delaney's voice sounded anxious, almost frightened and angry all at once. I wondered if he had discovered my deceit with Moira Adams. I looked up to see Daniel watching me and removed myself to the office alcove. The last time I saw Delaney and Moira, they looked less than harmonious. If Delaney was really after the truth and Moira was acting suspiciously, he would start questioning what she knew and her motive for keeping him in the dark. I decided it was time to do some pushing. "Actually, yes, the pieces are coming together nicely," I responded guilelessly. "Anything you care to share?" he asked eagerly. "Well, it seems there was information about Derek, the club owner, that wasn't used by the defense team." I paused. The problem with pushing or trying to motivate the players into making a move or a mistake is that you could overestimate the response. I was counting on using the dissension between the two and creating a wedge, but it could unify them and cause them to close ranks. Delaney was obviously contemplating what he should say next. I decided to give him some time. "Let's meet for coffee." Delaney had surprisingly opted to have coffee not at the establishment under his apartment, but at one near Moira Adams' townhouse. It seems he was unaware that I knew where he lived and I wasn't going to enlighten him. I arrived at Benoit Patisserie a few minutes ahead of him. Saturday morning saw the line for the French pastries long, but mainly for pickup as most wanted to enjoy a lazy winter morning by a fire at home. I found a table in the corner and took in the quaint interior. Although the clouds and snow had moved in and blocked the sun, the large windows let in plenty of light, and the brass pendant lighting reflected off walls of pale yellow, making it actually look sunny on the inside. The large display cases were polished to show the tarts, eclairs, and croissants to perfection. A young man approached my table just as Delaney Stevens walked in. I motioned to him, and the server rightly concluded Delaney made up my party of two and stepped aside to let him fall into his chair. "Coffee?" I asked neutrally. Delaney nodded instantly. "Yes, please." The server went to get our coffee, and I pushed the menu closer to him. "You look like you need to eat," I said frankly. He perused the menu, and when the server returned with our coffee, ordered a crepe with mushrooms, caramelized onions, spinach, ham, eggs, and Gruyere. I ordered the same, as well as a lemon tart, and sat back and sipped my coffee. Delaney stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. You know, I placed my spoon on the wooden table. You seem to be troubled by something. Would you like to talk about it? Delaney looked up at me, not quite meeting my eyes. I'm not sure what I should tell you, he replied bluntly. I sipped my coffee thoughtfully. I can see you might have a dilemma, but think of this. I am not your competition. I don't have anyone in the press I prefer to tell my story to. Honestly, I don't use the press. We sat quietly sipping our coffee. After a while, the server walked over with our 2 plates and another came with my tart. We tucked in and I waited to continue. The person who instigated the Aspen Club fire exhibit at the museum and the person who instigated your podcast series are one in the same. Moira Adams. Delaney's fork stopped midway between his plate and his mouth. I suspected you two knew each other. I looked at him intently. Can I speculate further? I continued when he gave a brisk nod. I think you have discovered that Moira Adams is keeping something from you. You may not be sure what it is, but you know she is holding back, and it's starting to bother you. I looked you up, Delaney. You're good. But let me ask you something. If you were working for a paper and your story started going in a different direction, and your editor wanted you to stick with the popular line, what would you have done? Delaney's jaw tightened, and he took a bite of his food to loosen it and give himself time to think. He finally spoke. She knows more than she should. Details of her aunt's plans. You know, like she... His voice trailed off. Like she was there? I finished for him. He nodded his head vigorously. Exactly. He punctuated it with a snap of his fingers. The morning rush in the bakery had died down, and I watched as the staff cleaned tables and filled in the glass display cases with pastries. The server came and refilled our coffee. I listened to the sounds from the kitchen and the muted sounds from the street, and relaxed. Delaney followed suit and sat back in his chair. Wiping his mouth, he placed his napkin on the table and stared at me. I dove in. What if she knows something that could exonerate Stormie Gyles? I let the question hang in the air for a moment, watching him carefully. I knew I had him because his subsequent squirming told me he had already reached that conclusion. He cursed under his breath. You know something, he accused. I shrugged. I've gathered enough evidence to prove that there was reasonable doubt. Such as? He asked with one eyebrow raised. For one thing, there was a plan in place to burn the club. There was a second policy on the club, and Stormie Gyles did not purchase it, nor was she the beneficiary. Delaney's eyes widened in shock. That wasn't in the court documents, he protested. I shook my head. No, it wasn't. And so as not to disparage the police, the prosecutor presents what they have, and ultimately it's up to the judge what the jury is allowed to hear. Delaney leaned in. What else did you discover? You know it was suspected that Derek was cheating. He nodded vigorously. Yes, Bailey Rogers. I cut him off with a hand motion. No, I gave him an intent look and said slowly. Derek was having an affair with Sasha Johnson, Moira Adams' aunt. Delaney's face froze, and he slowly swallowed. He wasn't without logical thought, however. But how could Moira know anything? She wasn't even born when her aunt died. He tapped the table and pondered the discrepancy. I let him think. Breakfast was turning into lunch, and although it was cold outside, the bright sun and crisp air was enticing. Delaney, I said as I stood up, let's walk. We paid our bill and exited the bakery and walked down the sidewalk. Little did I know we were being watched. Although the pavement had been cleared, our boots crunched on the remaining salt mixture used to melt the ice. We walked side by side, saying nothing. When he finally spoke, I was slightly taken aback by his suggestion. Maybe I could talk to her and get her to tell me what she knows. We followed the sidewalk to a small city garden path that wound around a busy street, designed to be an alternative route to protect pedestrians. The pathway was clear and lined by small, round evergreen bushes that were trimmed in ice. A brief wind took my breath away and gave me time to think. Up until that moment, I felt Delaney would be moved by the desire to get to the truth. But now I realized he was personally invested. I stopped and turned to face him. Delaney, are you in love with Moira Adams? Delaney looked at me and didn't answer. I looked around and spotted a mini gazebo and gently led him to sit out of the wind. The traffic was minimal. The only sound was the occasional scraping of winter boots on the path and the wind blowing ice-covered branches. I sat on the bench and motioned for him to sit next to me. Delaney sat down and hunched forward, resting his head in his hands. We met when I was working on a story about her employer, Orion. She fed me some information about her company's duplicity. The story put me on the radar at my paper, and to thank her, I took her out to dinner. I, well, I fell for her. I nodded. I get it. She's smart and beautiful. And maybe a bit vulnerable? I paused for his response. He nodded, a bit sad. Yeah, as brilliant as she is, she doesn't seem to know how things work outside of her world. Is she ambitious? I asked, already knowing the answer. He looked at me directly. Yes, she is, and I think that's another area that may get her into trouble. I needed to move Delaney into action. You suspect she's using her family tragedy to get a leg up? I continued without letting him speak. But it could backfire and ruin her. If she is withholding information that could prove what happened and uncover the real killer, she will be crucified in the press, even though it was over 40 years ago. Delaney jumped up and began to pace the small area sheltered from the light snow that was beginning to fall again. What is she thinking? He paced more and more, and I sat on the cold bench and watched. He stopped. But how could she know anything? Do you think maybe a family member told her? I wasn't prepared to lay out my diary theory just yet. I shrugged. Possibly. I think, he said slowly, that I do want to confront her, but he paused. I think you should be there with me. I think you could help me talk some sense into her. Maybe if you tell her what you've already discovered? He was warming up to his idea. We'll go to her place and wait for her. My heart quickened. You have the key? Of course, I stay there all the time. You'll come back with me? Sure, I'll follow you over.